Section 1. It was one of those late summer afternoons when everything felt calm, the kind of day where the cicadas hummed lazily in the trees, the smell of freshly cut grass drifted across the neighborhood, and I was standing near the fence I had just finished repairing last week, proud of the straight cedar posts and the sturdy rails that framed my property, when suddenly the tranquility was shattered by the unmistakable sound of tires screeching against pavement, followed by the sickening crunch of metal colliding with wood, a thunderclap of destruction that sent birds scattering from the trees. My heart lurched as I spun around just in time to see a blue Honda Civic, nose crumpled like an accordion, buried halfway into my fence, shards of splintered wood jutting through the grill like spears, steam hissing from the radiator as the car groaned to a halt. And for a moment there's only silence, the stunned pause after chaos, before the driver's side door flung open and out stumbled none other than Karen's teenage son, Jason, his face pale, his hands still clutching the glowing rectangle of his phone, the lock screen flickering with notifications that suggested he had been scrolling right up to the moment of impact. My stomach knotted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. This fence had taken me weeks of sweat and money to build, not to mention the fact that his reckless driving could have killed someone if they'd been walking along the edge of the property, but before I could even take a step forward to check if he was hurt, neighbors began pouring out of their homes, drawn by the noise, gasping at the wreckage, whispering about how fast he must have been going, how he had barely slowed before, careening straight into my property line. Jason staggered out, brushing at his hoodie like the dust and with chips clinging to it were just an inconvenience, muttering curses under his breath as if the world had betrayed him, and instead of showing the slightest shred of remorse, he immediately turned to his friends, two of whom were climbing out of the back seat, wide-eyed and shaken, and started blaming the road, the angle of the curve, even the visibility of the stupid fence, as though my cedar posts had leapt into his path on purpose. I could already feel the heat of frustration rising in my chest, but I kept my cool, stepping closer and asking calmly if everyone was okay, because injuries came first, repairs came later. Jason just sneered at me, tossing his phone into his pocket, and muttered, "Yeah, we're fine, but your fence wrecked my car." That was when the front door to Karen's house slammed open across the street, and here came the storm herself, marching down the sidewalk with all the fury of a general leading troops into battle, her voice shrill enough to cut through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. "What have you done to my son's car? Do you even realize how dangerous it is to have a fence like that so close to the road?" My jaw nearly hit the ground at the audacity, because here was her son, clearly guilty of reckless driving, his car embedded in my fence with skid marks trailing like arrows back down the street, and instead of asking if he was hurt, instead of apologizing, instead of even acknowledging the damage to my property, Karen was already spinning the situation as though I were the villain, her eyes flashing with that familiar mix of entitlement and rage I had come to know all too well from her years. Of HOA dictatorship. Neighbors exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes, others whispering that she had finally gone too far. But Karen didn't notice or didn't care. She stormed right up to me, jabbing a finger toward the crumpled wood, demanding to know what I planned to do about the hazard I had created. I bit back a laugh at the absurdity, because the only hazard had been her son barreling down a residential street at 20 miles over the limit while glued to his phone. But I simply folded my arms and said evenly, "Karen, your son just destroyed my fence. We would need to talk about your insurance covering the damages." That sentence lit the fuse. Her face turned crimson, her voice went up another octave, and she shrieked that I was insane, that the fence had no business being where it was, that she would call the sheriff, the HOA, the mayor if she had to, and that I would be paying for her son's car, not the other way around. Jason leaned against the wrecked car, arms crossed, smirking as though his mother's fury was some kind of shield that absolved him of responsibility, and the longer she ranted, the more I realized this wasn't going to be a simple neighborly resolution. This was going to turn into a battle the kind Karen thrived on, where logic and accountability bent beneath the weight of her entitlement. But what she didn't know, and what I was already quietly planning as I dialed the non-emergency sheriff's line on my phone while pretending to scroll, was that this time the evidence was stacked against her, the witnesses were everywhere, And no matter how loud she screamed, no amount of HOA threats or manipulative bluster could erase the fact that her son's car was nose first in my property, the law, and the community both on my side. And though it would take time and patience, I had a feeling. This would be the day the narrative flipped, and Karen would find herself on the losing end for once. Section 2 Karen's voice was already echoing across the neighborhood like a siren, shrill and unrelenting, and as she stood in front of the wreckage with her arms flailing, she began listing threats the way other people might list grocery items, rattling them off with increasing fury. First, she shouted that she would have the HOA fine me for unauthorized fencing, even though everyone knew I had filed the proper permits. Then she declared she would sue me personally for property endangerment. Then she shrieked that I would be paying for not only her son's smashed bumper, but also his psychological trauma from the accident, and the more she spoke, the more the crowd of neighbors around us grew, whispering among themselves, some of them with phones out recording every second. Because anyone who lived under Karen's HOA regime knew better than to trust her version of events without evidence, and now they finally had it. Jason, meanwhile, leaned against the dented car like some kind of tragic hero, clearly emboldened by his mother's performance, smirking as though the universe owed him a new car, tossing out lines like, "Yeah, my mom's right, you're gonna pay for this," which only made my blood boil further, but I kept my voice calm, measured, refusing to give Karen the dramatic shouting match she wanted, and simply said, "I've already called the sheriff. We'll let the professionals sort this out." That was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Her face twisted into pure rage, and she barked back, "Good, call them. They'll see that your fence is a danger to this community, and they'll fine you into the ground. Maybe they'll even order it torn down." But even as she shrieked, you could see the doubt flicker in her eyes because the evidence was right there in front of her, skid marks leading straight into my property, a mangled front end dripping radiator fluid into the dirt, the smell of burnt rubber hanging heavy in the air, and no matter how many times she screeched the words unsafe and hazard, they rang hollow compared to the undeniable reality of reckless driving. Neighbors who had been cowed into silence in the past were finding their voices now, and one after another they chimed in. Mrs. Patel, who lived 2 houses down, said she'd seen Jason speeding around the curve countless times and warned Karen weeks ago he'd cause an accident, while old Mr. Jenkins muttered loudly that he was glad it had only been a fence and not a child riding a bike. Karen spun on them with fury, accusing them of slander, threatening to file complaints with the HOA board. But the spell she used to hold over the community was breaking in real time because people weren't afraid anymore, they were angry, and her antics were being documented on half a dozen cameras that were already streaming live to neighborhood groups online. Through it all, I stood quietly, hands on my hips, watching Karen thrash and rant, knowing the sheriff was on his way, knowing this wasn't going to end the way she thought. And when she tried to corner me again, jabbing her manicured finger in my chest and hissing, "If you think for 1 second you're getting a dime out of me, you're mistaken. My family will not pay for your little country fence project." I leaned down just enough for her to hear my calm reply over the murmuring crowd. "Karen, your son crashed into my fence. That's the only fact that matters here. You can shout all you want, but the law doesn't bend for you." Her jaw snapped shut like I'd slapped her, her eyes blazing, and she stepped back as though physically recoiling from the truth of it. But even then she couldn't stop herself, spinning toward the crowd and screeching, "You'll all regret this. You'll see. I'll have this whole neighborhood paying for his car, if I have to." But her words, once terrifying, now sounded like the desperate cries of someone who knew the walls were closing in. The wail of sirens in the distance cut through her tirade, growing louder, closer, until finally a patrol SUV rolled up and Sheriff Daniels himself stepped out, his presence a calming force that instantly quieted the murmurs of the neighbors and, for a brief moment, even silenced Karen, though only because she was trying to compose her lies into something resembling a coherent story. And as the sheriff walked toward the scene with his notebook in hand, I knew that the next few minutes would decide everything. Whether Karen could spin this accident into yet another HOA-fueled nightmare for me, or whether, for the first time in years, she and her son would be forced to face consequences they couldn't wriggle out of, Section 3 Sheriff Daniels approached with the kind of deliberate calm that made everyone instinctively take a step back, his boots crunching against the gravel as he surveyed the wreck before him. The smashed blue Honda Civic still embedded in my cedar fence, steam curling into the evening air, and Jason slouched against the driver's side with a pout on his face that screamed entitlement more than injury, while Karen hovered nearby like a hawk preparing to swoop in, her posture rigid, her lips already twitching with the urge to spin the narrative in her favor, and I could see the sheriff take it all in, his eyes narrowing slightly as he followed the long black skid marks etched into the asphalt behind the car, lines that told the story more clearly than any words could. Speed, loss of control, and a desperate attempt to brake too late. Evening, Daniels said evenly, his voice steady, measured, the kind of tone that didn't invite theatrics, but Karen immediately ignored that and launched into her tirade. Pointing at me as though she were presenting evidence to a jury, "Sheriff, you need to do something about this man. He built a dangerous fence right next to the road, and my son had no chance to avoid it. This is negligence. He's trying to blame us, but really it's his fault for creating a hazard." The sheriff raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt, instead jotting something into his notebook before turning his gaze on Jason, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the scrutiny, his phone still buzzing in his hoodie pocket. "Son," Daniels said slowly, "were you on your phone while driving?" The question hit like a hammer, and Jason's smirk faltered, his eyes darting to his mother as if for a lifeline, but Karen jumped in instantly, screeching, "That is irrelevant. You should be asking why this fence was allowed to be built so close to the road. This whole thing is a setup." Daniels finally looked at her, and though his expression didn't change much, the edge in his voice was unmistakable when he replied, "Ma'am, I'll get to the fence. Right now, I'm asking your son a direct question. Were you using your phone?" Jason mumbled something inaudible, and Daniels pressed, "Speak up." With the whole neighborhood staring, Jason finally muttered, "Maybe," just for a second, which drew a collective gasp from the crowd and a sharp smack from Karen on his arm as she hissed, "Don't admit to anything." Daniels jotted down more notes, then asked Jason for his license and registration, and when the boy fumbled with his wallet, producing a half-crumpled card, the sheriff took it without comment, inspecting it with the kind of patience that only made Karen more frantic. She kept pacing, waving her hands, trying to redirect the focus. "Sheriff, you don't understand. This man has been targeting my family for months. He deliberately built this fence as a trap, and now he's trying to ruin us with false accusations. He even called you here just to humiliate us in front of the neighborhood." But the sheriff cut her off with a firm, "Ma'am, that's enough," his tone carrying the kind of finality that silenced even Karen for a moment, and then he turned to me, asking in that same steady voice to explain what happened. I told him plainly that I had been standing on my property when I heard the screech of tires, that Jason's car had come flying down the street and smashed into my fence, that multiple witnesses could testify to his speed and distraction, and that this wasn't the first time neighbors had seen him driving recklessly. Daniels nodded, jotting it all down, then turned to the crowd and asked if anyone had witnessed the moments before the crash, and one by one neighbors stepped forward. Mrs. Patel describing how she saw Jason looking down at his phone seconds before impact, Mr. Jenkins pointing out the long skid marks that only came from speeding, and even one of Jason's own friends reluctantly admitting, under Daniel's direct questioning, that Jason had been checking a group chat when the crash happened. Every testimony piled higher against Karen's carefully crafted fantasy, and you could see the cracks forming in her facade, her eyes darting desperately between the sheriff, the neighbors, and the wreck, her mouth opening and closing as though she could argue the physical evidence out of existence. But Daniels wasn't done. He walked the length of the fence, crouched down to inspect the broken posts, then measured the distance from the road, muttering aloud that the structure was well within property lines and perfectly legal, a fact I had already known, but that now carried the weight of official confirmation. When he returned, he spoke with the kind of authority that made Karen's face blanch. Ma'am, your son was speeding, distracted, and crossed into another property, causing damage. The fence is not at fault here. The liability is clear. The crowd murmured, some with satisfaction, others with relief, and Karen, realizing her grip on the situation was slipping, erupted like a volcano, shrieking that the sheriff was biased, that I had bribed him, that the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her family out of jealousy, and she demanded to speak to his superior, to the mayor, to anyone who would listen. But her voice cracked under the weight of its own absurdity, the neighbors shaking their heads, some even laughing quietly. At the spectacle, Jason, pale and sulking now that the gravity of the situation was sinking in, muttered something about needing to call his insurance, and Daniels, without missing a beat, told him he would also be cited for reckless driving and distracted operation of a motor vehicle, handing him a ticket that made Karen gasp as though she had been personally stabbed. She lunged forward, pointing her finger at Daniels, shouting that he couldn't do this, that she would make sure he lost his job, but he didn't even flinch, simply stating in his even drawl, "Ma'am, if you continue to interfere, I'll have no choice but to charge you with obstruction." That finally shut her up, though the fury on her face burned hotter than the setting sun, and as Daniels radioed in for a tow truck to remove the wreck from my fence line, the reality settled over everyone present. Karen's bluster had failed, her son was exposed, and for once the law was on the side of the people she had tormented for so long. Section for the sound of the approaching tow truck was like music to my ears, a deep mechanical rumble that grew louder until the massive rig turned onto our street, its amber lights flashing against the darkening sky, casting an almost theatrical glow over the gathered neighbors who stood in small clusters, whispering excitedly as if waiting for the climax of a long-awaited play. And when the truck pulled up beside the mangled Civic still wedged awkwardly into my broken fence, Jason's face went pale, while Karen immediately stepped forward, arms spread as though she could physically block the process, her voice cutting through the air with a shrillness that made everyone wince. "No, you're not touching this car. This vehicle is evidence, and it stays right here until my lawyer arrives." The tow operator, a burly man in grease-stained overalls who looked like he'd seen every form of roadside drama imaginable, barely raised an eyebrow, glancing instead at Sheriff Daniels, who gave him a single nod of approval. And with that, the operator went about his work, unrolling chains and positioning the truck with practiced ease, the whine of hydraulics underscoring Karen's escalating meltdown. She circled the car like a lioness guarding a cub, shouting about her rights, about lawsuits, about how this entire neighborhood would be sorry once she was done with them, while Jason slumped against the hood with crossed arms, muttering under his breath about how unfair it all was, his defiance cracking around the edges as the reality of losing his car settled in. Daniels tried one last time to calm Karen, telling her firmly that the vehicle was a hazard, leaking fluids onto my property and blocking part of the roadway, and that it was standard procedure to tow it to an impound lot until insurance and legal matters could be sorted. But she wasn't hearing a word, screeching instead that I had orchestrated this whole thing, that I had planted the fence here just to entrap her son, and that the sheriff, the tow driver, and even the neighbors were in on it. With me, the crowd, emboldened by the absurdity, began laughing openly, some recording every moment, others whispering gleefully that Karen had finally lost her grip on the power she had wielded like a weapon for years, and you could see the flush of humiliation spread across her cheeks as her words only fueled their amusement. But still she couldn't stop, screaming herself hoarse as the tow driver hooked chains to the undercarriage of the Civic. The metallic clank of the chains was the sound of inevitability, and when the winch engaged with a groaning whir, the Civic's front end lifted off the ground, splintered pieces of my fence falling away from its grille as though the car itself was being forced to let go of its crime. And Jason, seeing his pride and joy being dragged like roadkill, shouted in protest, demanding the driver put it back, threatening to call his uncle who's a lawyer, but his voice cracked with panic, betraying how much this hurt him. Karen rushed to the driver's side, pounding on the truck's door, shrieking that he was stealing her son's property, but Daniels stepped in with such commanding presence that she froze mid-rant, his hand hovering near his belt as he warned her one final time, "Ma'am, step back, or you'll be spending tonight in county." The effect was immediate. Karen's face twisted with impotent rage, her hands balled into fists at her sides, but she stumbled back, unable to cross that final line, forced to watch as the tow truck heaved Jason's battered Civic fully onto its flatbed, securing it with thick straps that made escape impossible. The neighborhood erupted, not in chaos, but in a ripple of satisfaction, murmurs of about time, and she had this coming passing from person to person, parents pulling their kids closer to watch the spectacle of accountability in action. And even I, though I kept my composure, outwardly felt a surge of vindication, a sense that for once the universe had tilted in the right direction. Jason climbed into Karen's shadow, muttering angrily but powerless, and Karen herself stood trembling, her hair disheveled, her voice hoarse from screaming, mascara streaked across her cheeks in jagged lines, a queen stripped of her crown, forced to bear witness as her fortress of intimidation collapsed around her. When the tow driver slammed the lever and the truck rumbled forward, dragging the Civic away under the fading glow of streetlights, Karen let out one last desperate cry. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." But the sound was hollow now, a broken echo bouncing off houses where no one feared her anymore. And as the truck disappeared around the corner, the crowd began dispersing, neighbors smiling, some clapping me on the shoulder, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. And though Karen tried to rally them with promises of vengeance, no one listened, no one cared, because the truth had been laid bare, her son's recklessness exposed, her authority shattered, and the symbol of her arrogance literally hauled away on the back of a truck. Standing there beside my broken fence, the splinters still fresh under my boots, I knew this was just the beginning of the fallout, because tomorrow the insurance calls would start, the fines and citations would hit, and Karen, for all her shrieking about power and control, would finally be forced to confront the reality she had long denied, that for once she couldn't bully, threaten, or scream her way out of consequences. Section 5, the fallout from that night, did not arrive with the dramatic fireworks Karen had promised in her shrill outbursts, but rather in the slow, grinding way that bureaucracy and accountability catch up with people who have spent their whole lives dodging it. And the first blow came the following morning when the insurance adjuster called me, a calm professional who explained in no uncertain terms that their investigation left no wiggle room. Karen's son was 100% at fault. The skid marks proved reckless driving, the witnesses' statements were unanimous, and her attempt to claim I had entrapped her son with a maliciously placed fence was not only laughable, but also flagged as borderline fraudulent. So the company would be covering every penny of the repair and legal costs, which meant my fence would be rebuilt stronger than before at her expense, and if she didn't like it, well, that was between her and her skyrocketing premiums. Word of this spread quickly among the neighbors because people talk, and soon Karen's front yard was abuzz with whispered judgments as families strolled by on their evening walks, shaking their heads at the irony that the woman who once bragged about keeping the neighborhood in line was now the source of the most embarrassing scandal the block had seen in years. But the real humiliation deepened when the sheriff's office called Jason in, citing him not just for reckless driving, but for operating a vehicle while using his phone, the dash camera of a neighbor catching the exact moment he glanced down at his screen seconds before losing control, and the ticket alone carried a fine big enough to make even a wealthy family sweat, but paired with a 6-month license suspension, Jason suddenly went from cocky suburban hotshot to a grounded teenager reliant on Karen to drive him everywhere, and nothing seemed to cut deeper than the sight of him sitting in the passenger seat of her minivan while the same kids he used to mock drove past him with their freshly minted licenses, laughing at his downfall. Karen, meanwhile, tried to spin the narrative, cornering neighbors to claim she was being persecuted, telling the HOA that I had set her up, that the sheriff was biased, that the tow truck operator had been bribed, but the more she screamed, the less anyone listened, until eventually even the board, once terrified of her temper, voted unanimously to fine her for violating neighborhood codes, the irony of being fined by the very system she used to weaponize against others was not lost on anyone, least of all Karen, who showed up at the next meeting red-faced and shaking, only to storm out when her objections were dismissed without even being added to the minutes. My fence was rebuilt within a week, sturdier and more polished than before, with Karen footing the bill, And I made sure to invite the same neighbors who had witnessed her meltdown to a small barbecue to celebrate the grand reopening of the fence, a tongue in cheek event that had people laughing and swapping stories late into the night, while Karen's house remained dark and silent across the street, blinds drawn tight, as though she could shut out the noise of her own humiliation, though we all knew she was seething inside, pacing like a caged animal. By the end of the month, Jason's car sat in the impound lot still accruing fees, Karen's insurance had jacked up her rates, and the HOA board had stripped her of her self-appointed role as rule enforcer, telling her in writing that any further harassment of neighbors would be grounds for formal complaints, and I could see the shift in the community. The fear was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism, as though everyone had realized that the monster they thought held power over them was nothing more than smoke and noise. Karen still hurled the occasional threat, shouting from her porch that she'd get even, but no one responded anymore. Her words carrying no weight, just echoes lost in the laughter of children playing in yards she once patrolled with a clipboard, and the sight of her son mowing lawns for extra cash to pay off his fines while avoiding eye contact with anyone became a running joke among the teens. For me, the sweetest part wasn't the fence being restored, or even the official penalties. It was the look on Karen's face when she realized she no longer had an audience, when the sheriff, the neighbors, the HOA, even her own son's friends had stopped entertaining her theatrics, and she was left standing in the ruins of her false authority, a dethroned queen whose crown had been yanked off by nothing more than her own arrogance colliding with reality. And as I leaned against my brand new fence, one quiet evening, sipping a cold drink while the sun dipped low, I knew the saga was over, not with a dramatic explosion, but with something far more satisfying, the simple, undeniable truth that for once, Karen and her reckless son had been forced to face consequences, and no amount of shouting could tow them away.